Roy Mallett had spent 41 years measuring things and writing them down. He died on a Thursday in March of 2021, and he was gone 4 months before the fence crew came. But it was Roy who stopped them. Not the lawyers, not the judge, not the county board. Roy, a man who had been measuring the same ground since Lyndon Johnson was president, and who had never once trusted another man's number without checking it himself. Stories like this don't get told much anymore. If you grew up around people who worked with their hands and didn't say much about it, hit subscribe. We're going to keep telling them as long as you keep watching. Earl Devens had been a licensed land surveyor in Furnace County, Nebraska for 31 years when he retired in 2019. He hadn't planned on being involved in what happened to Norma Mallett. He was 67 years old, he had a garden that needed attention and a knee that needed replacing. And he had made a point of not getting involved in other people's property disputes since a boundary fight between two brothers in Beaver City in 2011 that had taken 14 months to resolve, and had cost both of them more in legal fees than the disputed strip of ground was worth per acre. He got involved anyway. He said later he didn't see how he couldn't. Devens had known Roy Mallett the way surveyors know each other across county lines. Not personally close, but professionally aware. He knew Roy's reputation for precision. He knew Roy had been the go-to man for boundary work in southern Furnace County for 4 decades. The kind of surveyor who would rerun a traverse 3 times before he filed if the closure didn't satisfy him. He'd heard Roy's name on disputed corners the way you hear a musician's name on a difficult piece. The man knew what he was doing. And if Roy Mallett had set a pin, you could be confident the pin was right. He heard about the fence on a Saturday morning in late July 2021. His neighbor, a woman named Carol Feist, who worked at the county extension office, mentioned it at the gas station. Mentioned it the way you mention something troubling that you can't quite do anything about. A development company out of Kearney had put a crew on Norma Mallett's fence line at 3 in the morning and taken down 340 feet of woven wire and cedar posts along her south boundary. Taken it down and left it in a pile. Put up a notice on a T-post that referenced a plat revision filed with the county 3 weeks earlier. Devens drove out to the Mallett place that afternoon. He didn't call ahead. The Mallett farm was 218 acres of mixed cropland and grass pasture in the rolling ground south of Arapahoe, Nebraska, in Furnace County. The kind of place that looks unremarkable from the road and is everything to the people who have farmed it. Roy and Norma Mallett had bought the south half in 1974 and the north half in 1983. And they had raised 2 daughters there and replaced the machine shed roof twice and put a new well in 2008. Roy had run a small cow-calf operation on the grass ground until his knees made the daily work impractical. And in his last years, he had cash rented the crop acres to a neighbor and spent his mornings in the shop and his afternoons reading. He was not a man who left things undocumented. That is the part that matters. The fence that came down in July of 2021 marked Norma Mallett's south boundary, the line between her pasture and 480 acres of ground that had changed hands 3 times in 6 years before landing with a Kearney company called Meridian Agricultural Holdings. Meridian had filed a plat revision in Furnace County on July 6, 2021, referencing a 2019 aerial boundary analysis that placed the true south line of the Mallett parcel approximately 22 feet north of where the woven wire fence had stood for the better part of 4 decades. 22 feet, the length of a 2-car garage. Across 340 feet of boundary, that came out to roughly 1/3 of an acre. 1/3 of an acre of Furnace County pasture was not worth a great deal in the open market. Call it $800 to $100 depending on the year. The money was not the issue. The issue was that Meridian survey, if it held, put that 22-foot strip inside their property line. and with it, a corner of Norma Mallett's existing fence, an older drainage easement Roy had negotiated in 1988, and the access path her son-in-law used to reach the south gate. The issue was that Meridian had acted on that survey at 3 in the morning without notice, without permission, and without waiting for the dispute process the county's own plat revision rules required before any physical action could be taken. Norma Mallett was 73 years old. She had found out about the fence at 5:30 in the morning when she walked to the kitchen window, and the tree line to the south looked different. She had called her daughter in Arapaho. She had not cried. She had gone to the shop, opened the tall gray filing cabinet Roy kept his survey records in, and she had started reading. Roy Mallett had a filing system. 4 drawers in a 2-drawer lateral file he'd added a second unit to in 1997 when the first one filled up. The bottom 2 drawers held what his daughters called his paper farm. Every plat map, every survey abstract, every boundary description, every tax parcel map, every aerial photograph he'd ever ordered, organized by year and by boundary designation, each folder labeled in his handwriting with a black felt marker that he kept in a coffee can on the second shelf above the workbench. He had been adding to it since 1961, when he was 22 years old, and had gone to work for a survey crew out of McCook, Nebraska, and learned under a man named Gordon Pruitt, who chewed days' work tobacco and who once made Roy rerun a half-mile traverse from scratch because the closure was off by 1.5 feet, that a line on the ground was either right or it wasn't. There was no close enough. Pruitt had been doing boundary work in southwest Nebraska since 1946. He had a rule about old evidence that he repeated every time a young man on his crew tried to skip directly to the math. Find the oldest thing that can still be found and build from there. Not the newest monument, not the most recent deed. The oldest reliable anchor you can locate and verify. Original GLO corners from the government survey. Witness trees if they were still standing. Stone monuments set by the original county surveyor. A fence line that a homesteader had built in 1903 along a line that had been measured by a government crew in 1878 and that nobody had touched since, was better evidence than a concrete monument somebody had set in 1965 without checking their work. Gordon Pruitt had told Roy that a survey was only as good as the evidence it was built from, not the equipment, not the math, not the license hanging on the wall of the office, but the evidence. The man with the oldest reliable anchor would always win the argument. Always. Roy Mallett had understood this the way some people understand things they were born suited to understand. He had worked for Pruitt's crew for 4 years, earned his own license in 1967, done boundary work across Furnace County and parts of Red Willow and Harlan counties for 2 decades before he started buying ground of his own. And in all that time, he had never filed a plat that he couldn't show his work on back to the oldest available monument. He brought that habit home with him. He applied it to his own land the way he'd applied it to other people's land for hire. He built the filing cabinet because Gordon Pruitt had told him to always keep the evidence, and because Roy Mallett was not a man who took advice and then forgot it. He had built that filing cabinet over 41 years as a form of evidence preservation. Not out of tidiness, not out of habit exactly. Out of the knowledge that the time would come and you would need to show your work. He never said that to anyone in so many words. His daughter Linda said he just never threw anything away that had a number on it. She said she'd thought it was a quirk until the summer of 2021. She doesn't think that anymore. The filing cabinet held, among other things, 6 survey plat maps of the south boundary of the Mallett farm going back to 1961. The oldest one was a copy Roy had obtained from the Nebraska State Surveyor's Office in 1974. When he first bought the property, a GLO-referenced plat from the original government survey of Furnace County, which had been completed in 1873. Roy had gotten it because Gordon Pruitt had told him to always find the oldest document first, before you look at anything else. The 1873 plat showed the section corner monuments, the quarter corner monuments, and the original chain-measured distances between them. Roy had also, in 1989, commissioned a boundary survey of his south line when a prior owner of the neighboring ground had questioned the fence location. The surveyor he'd hired, a man named Ted Orphan out of Oxford, Nebraska, had run the traverse from a government monument on the northeast corner of Section 19, a monument that had been undisturbed since the county resurveyed the section corners in 1947, and had set 2 new iron pins at the corners of the Mallet south boundary. He'd filed the plat with the county. He'd given Roy a copy, which was in the 3rd drawer, in a tube, with the date written in Roy's handwriting on the outside of the tube. The fence, at every point along its 340-foot run, was within 4 inches of the line Ted Orphan had set in 1989. Norma knew this because Roy had told her once, years ago, when she'd asked him why he'd kept the old fence posts on the new line instead of pulling them and starting fresh. He'd said the old fence was right. She hadn't fully understood what that meant at the time. She understood it that July morning. Earl Devens arrived at the Mallet farm at 2:30 in the afternoon. Norma met him at the door. She had the filing cabinet drawer open on the kitchen table, and she had the 1989 survey plat laid out flat with a coffee mug on each corner to keep it from rolling up. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. He looked at the 1873 GLO plat she'd found in a folder behind the tube. He asked if he could see the abstract of title. She brought it from the 2nd drawer. He sat down at the kitchen table and read for 45 minutes. He said he didn't know why Meridian Survey had placed the line 22 feet north. He said there were a few possibilities: a different starting monument, a different deed interpretation, an error in the 2019 aerial that hadn't been caught, and that he'd want to look at their filed plat before he said anything else. He said what he could tell her was that Ted Orphan had been a careful surveyor, that the 1989 work looked right from what he could see, and that Roy had been correct to note the fence position when he'd had the work done. He said the GLO distances from 1873 and the Orphan distances from 1989 were consistent with each other within a margin that was appropriate for the methods used. He told me they matched, Norma said later. Roy's line and the old government line, they matched. Devens came back the next morning with his total station and his field notes. He spent 4 hours on the south boundary of the Mallet farm, running from the same Section 19 monument Ted Orphan had used in 1989, checking the iron pins Orphan had set, measuring to the remnant fence posts that Meridian's crew had left in the ground when they'd pulled the wire and the cedar rails. He brought the numbers home and closed the traverse on his laptop that evening. The Orphan pins were right. The fence had been right. The Meridian survey had been run from a different starting monument, a county road monument that had been reset in 2004 during a road improvement project, and that had been placed, according to the road crew's own records, approximately 19 feet east of the original position. 19 feet of monument shift, propagated across a boundary traverse, could easily produce a 22-foot error at the far end of a line. It was not a fraudulent survey. It was a survey built on a flawed reference point, and nobody at Meridian or their surveying firm had checked the 2004 reset against older evidence before they filed. Roy Mallet had older evidence. He had been collecting it since 1961. Devens prepared an affidavit of survey. He attached copies of the 1873 GLO plat, the 1989 Orphan plat, and his own 2021 field notes, with a table showing the comparison of distances from the Section 19 monument under all 3 surveys. The numbers aligned. He filed the affidavit with the Furnace County Surveyor's Office on August 9, 2021, 19 days after Meridian's crew had come in the dark and pulled down Norma Mallet's fence. The county board convened a special boundary dispute session on September 14th in the commissioner's room in the Furnace County Courthouse in Beaver City, Nebraska. The room had a dropped ceiling and fluorescent lights and 6 rows of folding chairs, most of which were occupied by people who had no direct stake in the matter, but who understood that what happened here would set a precedent for how the county handled the Meridian consolidation going forward. Norma Mallett sat in the second row. Her daughter Linda sat beside her. Norma had brought a folder with copies of the survey plats, the 1873 document, the 1989 orphan plat, and Devon's 2021 affidavit. She had paper-clipped them in order and written the dates on the tabs in the same black felt marker Roy kept in the coffee can. Meridian's representatives presented first. They had 2 attorneys from Kearney and a licensed surveyor from Grand Island named Holcomb, who walked the board through the 2019 aerial analysis using a projector and a laser pointer. The analysis was professional. The presentation was clear. Holcomb was competent. He explained how aerial boundary analysis worked, how the GIS layers had been calibrated, and how the resulting line differed from the existing fence position. By a distance he called within acceptable margins for this type of work. He did not mention the 2004 road monument reset. Either he didn't know about it, or he decided it wasn't relevant. Earl Devens, sitting in the third row, did not change his expression either way. Devens presented after a 10-minute recess. He had no projector. He had 3 pages of field notes, a comparison table he'd typed in a large font because the board members were all past 60, and the original copy of the 1873 GLO plat that Norma had found in Roy's third drawer and had asked him to bring. He walked the board through the section corner monument, the chain distances from the original government survey, Ted Orphan's 1989 pins, and his own 2021 measurements. He put the numbers in a single column and showed how each survey related to the one before it. Then he explained the 2004 road monument. He had found the county road department's records from that year publicly available in the same courthouse building that showed the monument had been reset approximately 19 feet east of its pre-project position. He had a copy of those records. He set it on the table in front of the board chairman. The room was quiet for a moment. Not dramatic exactly. Just the kind of quiet that happens when a room full of people who understand land all arrive at the same place at the same time. One of the board members, a man named Gerald Schroeder from the East District, who had farmed Furnace County ground his whole life, asked Devens a single question. He asked whether, if you started the traverse from the original monument position rather than the 2004 reset, you got Norma Mallett's fence line or Meridian's fence line. Devens said you got Norma Mallett's fence line within 4 inches. Schroeder nodded once and didn't ask anything else. The board voted to rescind Meridian's plat revision, 3-1. The dissenting vote came from a board member who said he wasn't sure it was the board's place to adjudicate competing surveys. Not an unreasonable position, just the wrong call on this particular set of facts. The 3 who voted to rescind said it plainly enough. When you have a government survey from 1873, a professional survey from 1989, and a field verification from 2021 all producing the same line, and one aerial analysis from 2019 producing a different one because it started from a monument that had been moved 19 feet in 2004. The weight of the evidence was not a close question. Meridian did not appeal. They replaced the fence. Woven wire, cedar posts, 8 feet on center. They hired a contractor out of Holdragi. The work was done by the first week of November, before the ground froze. Norma Mallett did not watch them do it. She said later she had no need to. She's 75 now. She still farms the place, cash renting the crop acres to the same neighbor Roy had used. running a small number of stocker cattle on the grass ground from spring to fall with her son-in-law's help. She put new corner posts on the replaced south fence in the spring of 2022 because the cedar Meridian's contractor had used was the wrong grade for that exposure, and she knew it would rot faster than it should. She used a bobcat her son-in-law owns to set them. The posts are in straight and the wire is tight. The line is exactly where Roy's line always was. The gray filing cabinet is still in the shop. Her daughter Linda has asked more than once whether Norma ought to scan everything in it and make digital copies, put it all on a hard drive, somewhere backed up, so it can't be lost to a fire or a flood. Norma says she's going to get to that. She hasn't gotten to it yet. She probably will. She also said the paper doesn't crash when the power goes out, and that Roy had filed everything in order by year and by boundary, and that she could find anything in that cabinet inside of 3 minutes if she knew what she was looking for. She said she'd learned his system the way you learn someone's handwriting, gradually and then all at once. Earl Devens got his knee replaced the following spring. He still does occasional expert witness work in boundary disputes, not often, but when the situation is one he thinks he can help with. He said the mallet case was not the most complicated survey dispute he'd worked on in 31 years. He said it was one of the clearest. He said the only reason it was clear was because a man he'd never met had spent 41 years putting paper in a filing cabinet. He said he didn't know what made Roy Mallet the kind of person who did that. Some people are just built that way. They measure carefully. They keep what they write, and they trust that the record will speak for them when they are no longer in the room to speak themselves. Roy had been gone 19 months by the time Furnace County rescinded Meridian's plat revision. He was not there to see it. He didn't need to be. A careful man's records are patient in a way the man himself can never be. They wait in drawers, in tubes, in manila folders. They don't age the way memory does. A line measured true in 1989 is still true in 2021. The number doesn't change just because the man who wrote it down is gone. That is what Roy Mallet knew. That is what he left behind.